is that these trumpets were sent because at the time the trumpets start, we relate that to the Pergamus church and the Thyatira church because that's when the trumpets start. They don't start in AD 31 or AD 100. They don't start under the church of Ephesus and Smyrna. They don't start until we get to Pergamus. And that's key to understanding the trumpets because the trumpets then should be understood as God's judgment on a church that was apostatizing. He was trying to warn them and to bring them back in line. It was corrective. So the trumpets in the Bible symbolize war, announce judgment against enemies, and call God's people to prepare spiritually for his final day of reckoning. And I know there's only 3. Now I had 6 and now I've whittled it down to 3. So the starting date for the first trumpet is about 410 AD. Here's the dates for the Pergamus church, 313 to 538. So it was during this time that we see all this turmoil and the establishment of doctrines of men that was taking place. Acceptance of paganism was brought into the church. Sunday worship was brought into the church during this time so that it eclipsed Sabbath keeping. God didn't do away with Sabbath keeping. Christ didn't do away with Sabbath keeping. The church did away with Sabbath keeping, and it happened during this time period. It didn't happen at the time of Christ. So we see under the Pergamus church we have a compromise with paganism, this great falling away that Paul talked about in 2 Thessalonians 2, and we've studied that in depth already. And this Gnostic philosophy about the Godhead was exalted, and traditions replaced the Bible. Satan couldn't do anything with the church working from the outside through pagan Rome. He battered at the church, persecuted the people. During the Smyrna church, there was so much compromise, so much persecution, that there was scarcely any Christian that had a whole body. They had arms chopped off, they had legs chopped off, eyes poked out, because they were so persecuted. They crucified them. They did anything they could to try to deter them from accepting the Christian faith. This is what pagan Rome did to Christians. In 313, that all stopped because Constantine says, we're not going to have this. I'm not going to run my government that way. So he quit persecuting Christians. Well, he quit persecuting Christians, but it opened the door for paganism to come in. The Thyatira church was a time period under which paganism became firmly established within the church, and the papacy was established. Doctrines that were contrary to the Bible were developed, and persecution of God's people began by the church. Before it was pagan Rome that was persecuting. Now it was the church that persecuted anybody who wouldn't believe like they did. And that continued up to the time of reformers. Remember, we studied that when we studied the churches. That during this time, people were burned at the stake if you didn't believe like the church demanded that you believe and accept their doctrines. With all this establishment of various points, let's go now and read the text from the Scripture. And then we'll go on to the next slide. We want to start reading Revelation chapter 8, verse 6. And the 7 angels which had the 7 trumpets prepared themselves to sound. The first angel sounded, and there followed hail and fire mingled with blood. And they were cast upon the earth, and a third part of the trees burnt up, and all green grass was burnt up. And the second angel sounded, and as it were a great mountain burning with fire was cast into the sea. And a third part of the sea became blood. And a third part of the creatures which were in the sea, and had life, died. And the third part of the ships were destroyed. And the third angel sounded, and there fell a great star from heaven, burning as it were a lamp. And it fell upon the third part of the rivers, and upon the fountains of waters. And the name of the star was called Wormwood. And the third part of the waters became wormwood, and many men died of the waters, because they were made bitter. And the fourth angel sounded, and the third part of the sun was smitten, and the third part of the moon, and the third part of the stars. So as the third part of them was darkened, and the day shone not for a third part of it, and the night likewise. And I beheld and heard an angel flying through the midst of heaven, saying with a loud voice, Woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth by reason of the other voices of the trumpet of the 3 angels which are yet to sound. Like I said earlier, Christ gave this vision to John, and he covered an awful lot of history. A lot of things happened in just these 8 verses. And that's where I got bogged down in how much to bring to the lesson today. There are parallels here, and if you're familiar with the prophecies of the chapter 16 and the plagues that are going to fall, there's parallels. In the plagues and here, symbology is used of hail, fire, blood, sea and rivers being affected. The sea becomes blood. Sea creatures died. There are 3 parts talked about here. There are 3 parts talked about in chapter 16, and darkness in both prophecies. That's just an aside. I just want to put it in your mind that there's parallels, because last week we talked so much about the parallels. But all this is pointing to similar symbols between these wars and the final war between Christ and Satan. So let's look at the trumpets. The first 4 trumpets concern the overthrow of the western half of the old Roman Empire. Not the eastern half, just the western half. The third part relates to the division of the Roman Empire after Constantine the Great died. When he died in AD 337, his 3 sons divided up the Roman Empire among themselves. One of them took Turkey and the Balkans, what we call now the Balkan states, where that is, where we've had all the wars with Croatia and all that. That's the Balkan states. He took part of that and ruled from Constantinople. The second son took the eastern sector, which was the Mediterranean area where Syria and Antioch and Persia, and he took that part, and Egypt. The third son took Italy and all the islands and northern Africa. That was his part. So they split it up and they co-ruled, but each kind of ruled their own sector, but that's how they split the area up. The first trumpet now is generally understood by most commentators to be Alaric of the Goths. In 395, the emperor at that time in Rome died, and it left Italy weak. And the Goths began to push south into Italy. They had never been in Italy. They had been on the other side of the mountains in Switzerland. And they had been up in Germany, and they had been over into the Romania, what we have now is Romania and Hungary and whatnot. That's where they lived. They didn't come over the mountains until this time. So the first trumpet is Alaric the Goth, and in AD 410, he actually conquered the city of Rome. The second trumpet is Genseric and the Vandals. Genseric operated from 440 to 455. In 455, he conquered the city of Rome. The third trumpet is Attila and the Huns. Attila began in 434 to just sort of harass the area. He really never actually conquered Rome, and he died in 453. The fourth trumpet is Odoacer and the fall of Western Roman Empire when there was no more Caesars after this time. After 476 AD, when Odoacer came in and deposed the Caesar that was there at that time, then Rome ceased as a political form of government. During this time, darkness in the religious world and the political worlds was great. There was no learning, no school learning. There was no advancement in medicine. There was no advancement in any kind of education. There was no advancement in scripture learning. The Bible was taken away from the people. This was a very dark time. That's why it's called the Dark Ages. The fifth trumpet is the rise of Islam. Now, we won't cover that today. We're going to cover the last 3 trumpets next week. But I'm just wanting to summarize them all here together. The fifth trumpet relates to the first woe. Yes?
On the slide previous to this one, you had 476 AD. That was just a single date.
476 AD was when they captured Rome and deposed the final.
Okay, was that the beginning of the fourth trumpet, and then on the next page, then those dates are the fourth trumpet dates?
No. The fourth trumpet began before this, but the 476 was when they actually conquered. We'll get into it more. This is just a summary. This is not the last time you're going to see this morning. So the sixth trumpet concerns Islam. and we'll get into this next week. I'm not going to try to explain this right now, but these dates are pretty absolute. We know when Islam came into effect. We know how long it lasted in its first push.